Welcome. This is a rainy edition today. We are going to take a deep dive and get a little nerdy on body weight, internal and external resistance, what Roger Ishins called actions, and the challenge of feeling your movement as you're doing yoga. What I am hoping to do here is to show you some different ways to modify some of the yoga movement that you do in your regular practice so that you gain a little better understanding of how your body moves, and also to engage different muscles by using internal and external resistance. By engaging those other muscles, you'll gain additional feeling in the muscles, and you'll gain additional strength in the muscles from doing the poses a little bit differently than you might normally do them. So this is not going to be a regular sequence. This is more kind of an exploratory dive into body weight, internal and external resistance. So let's get started. Body weight. Body weight is just a very broad category of movement. That means that the resistance that is provided to your body is provided by the weight of your body. Of course, you need some gravity to assist in that, but between gravity, the weight of your body, and the alignment that you do with your movement, those three things combine to provide you some resistance, and you move against that resistance. And that's what we do for all kinds of different movement techniques. One of the problems that astronauts have in the space station is that gravity is very light, and so they don't get much resistance. And so it's a constant struggle for them to continue to move in such a way that they can maintain muscle mass. We don't really have that problem on the planet because of the gravity and the weight of our own bodies. So let's look at internal resistance. Internal resistance is where you engage muscles to resist other muscles. And we can show you that very simply if we look at the elbow joint, the biceps, the triceps. So if I engage both the triceps and the biceps, and I try to move my hand towards my shoulder, and I resist with the triceps, what I've got there is an internal resistance. So in other words, this muscle, the triceps, is resisting the movement of that muscle. So I've got two muscles working against each other. That is internal resistance. Now, it's not just limited to two muscles. There can be multiple muscles working contrary to each other. And we'll look at some of those scenarios. One of the first yoga teacher that I really said, yes, this makes perfect sense to me, was Roger Ishins. And Roger talked about using internal resistance. He called it actions, but it's internal resistance. He used internal resistance quite a bit. And he would have us use different muscles and engage those muscles to counteract other muscles. And between the two of them, you are able to gain a good deal of strength because all of the muscles are involved. It's not just one or the other. The two are working against each other. So let's look at a movement there that we just looked at a second ago, and that is the movement in the elbow joint with the biceps and the triceps working against each other. When we have internal resistance and there is no movement in the joint, that is what's known as an isometric contraction. Now, there are three different types of contractions, types of muscular contractions. First one is isometric. The isometric contraction is one where the muscle, in this case, the bicep, is engaged, it's under tension, but there's no movement in the joint. There's no movement in the joint. So in this scenario, this muscle is engaged, there's no movement in this joint, and therefore we have an isometric muscle contraction. The tricep is resisting the bicep, so there's no movement. So that's the first of the three muscle types, muscle contraction types. Second one is a concentric contraction, and that is one that we're pretty familiar with, and that is that the muscle is engaged and the muscle shortens. So if we look at this movement from here, as we come in this direction, the muscle contracts, it shortens, there's movement in the joint. So that is a concentric muscle contraction. The third muscle contraction is a eccentric muscle contraction, and that is the muscle is engaged, the muscle's under tension, but the muscle is actually lengthening. And so if we start in the same basic position, looking at the bicep, if we start in an isometric fashion and we move away from the shoulder in this direction, the bicep is lengthening, and that is an eccentric contraction of the bicep. So no movement, there's isometric. The muscle shortening, that's concentric. The muscle lengthening, that's eccentric. So those are the three muscle types, and we're going to be looking at those and how they work together to add a little bit more spice and a little bit more strengthening. And certainly, since you're using different muscles in different ways, it's going to feel a lot different too as you do these yoga movements. So let's take a look at a quick example of an external resistance. So I've got a little bit of weight here. What we were just doing is internal resistance. One muscle was resisting the movement of the other muscle. What we're going to do here with external resistance is we're going to use a weight. So external resistance could be in yoga, typically straps, blocks, could be weights, could be people providing resistance to whatever movement it is you're doing. So if we look at this same scenario, muscles engaged, muscles under tension, no movement. That's an isometric contraction. Muscle is engaged, muscle is shortening, there's movement in the joint. This is a concentric movement. And muscle engaged, muscle lengthening, that is an eccentric movement. So if we start and we look at just a traditional curl using a hand weight, we do concentric, eccentric, concentric, eccentric. So any time when the muscle is shortening like this, that's a concentric contraction. There's an eccentric contraction. The eccentric contraction can lead to a lot more strength. I think I saw something that said something like 40% higher strength from doing eccentric movement compared to simply doing concentric movement. So it can offer a lot of benefits in terms of strength and range of motion. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of the movements that Roger did and taught, and we'll move this fancy chair out of the way. So when Roger was talking about actions or internal resistance, he would typically have us have the muscles working against each other. So what I'm going to show you is a very simple forward flexion and some of the actions that he would have us do. So he would have us find a spot below the ankle bone, and below the ankle bone, that spot would push to the left. So ankle bone left. Just above the ankle, he would have us push to the right. So see if you can get those two actions or internal resistance moving. So there's not going to be much movement. You can feel the ankle maybe wiggle a little side to side as you figure out how to make that work. What do you feel right now? You probably feel like your foot is engaged. The muscles are engaged. They're under tension. And that's what internal resistance is. Now, if we work our way up the leg, in addition to those two actions, he would have us move inside with the just above the knee or right at the knee, and outside up here at the mid thigh. So this knee tends in, the thigh up here tends out, and the two cancel each other out. So there is no movement. It's an isometric muscle contraction. You can feel right now the entire leg should be lit up with the muscles engaged. That's internal resistance. So what Roger would have us do is start in a standing mountain, find all of those actions, those internal resistances. That's quite a word. Internal resistances. So below the ankle bones, pressing in, just above the ankle, pressing out, above the knee, pressing in, and in the mid-thigh, pressing out. So see if you can get all of those actions, those internal resistances, engaged. And what do you find? This is an isometric muscle contraction. The muscles are engaged, they're under tension, there's no movement. So we're going to add one more to that. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring the hamstrings in. I'm going to turn sideways so you can see what we do. So those same four basic actions. Below the ankle bones, pressing in towards each other. Above the ankles, pressing out, away from each other. Knees pressing in towards each other. Middle of thighs pressing out, away from each other. And then we add the hamstrings pressing back. So back towards the back of your mat. So notice those hamstrings. You can put your hand back here and see if you can feel the hamstrings engage. It may take a little while. This is not something you can pick up instantly. It did require, for me especially, quite a number of sessions before this started to make any kind of sense. So there's all those actions, 5 different actions, 5 including the hamstrings back. Now that we have those actions, we're going to hold those actions and we're going to move right from the hip joint. So keeping that nice long back, we flex forward, we come back up. Try to keep those actions through the whole stroke. Down and up. Down and up. And we're not going to worry about the breathing too much today. I typically exhale on the way down. Inhale up. Exhale down. Inhale up. There we go. So, how are you doing on keeping those internal resistances, those actions, as Roger called them, keeping those together, keeping all of them engaged while you do this movement? Yeah, let's do a couple more. We are keeping the back nice and long. There's no movement in the back. We're not doing a forward bend. This is a forward flexion. There's movement in the hip joint And there's a tiny bit of movement in the knee. And release. There we go. So that'll give you kind of an example of Roger's actions or internal resistance being used to change the dynamics, to change the muscles that are used when you do a particular movement. And so if you were able to maintain that internal resistance through the whole sequence there, you probably feel like your legs feel a bit different, quite a bit different than they typically would if you were just doing a forward flexion without having those internal resistances in place. And that was part of what Roger taught about, was to start with those internal resistance, all those actions, which is an isometric contraction, and then add movement. And the movement could be a concentric or an eccentric contraction. So let's look, since we're talking about those three different types, let's take one more look at this same forward flexion. So I engage those 5 different actions. Below the ankles, pressing together. Above the ankles, pressing apart. Knees pressing together. Mid-thighs pressing apart. Hamstrings pressing back towards the back of the mat. Slight bend in the knees. And there's a forward flexion. Come back up. Forward flexion. Back up. And go ahead and release. So what we're going to do next is see if we can turn on those 5 actions, those 5 different movements simultaneously. So let's see if we can do that. Below the ankles together, above the ankles apart, knees together, mid-thighs apart, hamstrings back. If you're able to turn all of those on, there's your isometric contraction by using internal resistance. In other words, we create the resistance internally. Muscles counteract other muscles. And release. So there are different ways that we can do that same sort of thing without doing internal resistance, and that is by doing external resistance. And in terms of that particular movement, one way that we can do that is by using a strap. And I'm using a gait belt here. It's a bit wider than your typical yoga strap and a little more comfortable. What we're going to do is put that belt just above the knees. And we want to have a little bit of play in it so that when you stand in standing mountain, in other words, your feet about hip width apart, there should be a little bit of play in the belt. Now, when you push your knees forward and bend them a little bit, take a side view here, knees come forward a little bit. With the knees forward, that belt should tighten up and you should be able to press out strongly against that belt. I've got this a little too loose. Let me tighten that just a hair. There we go. All right, so I've got that belt. I'm pressing the knees against the belt, so the knees are pressing out. And you will notice that what we have right now is another isometric contraction. It may not be quite as intense because we're really not focusing on the lower part of the leg. We've got the strap here just above the knees, but as you press strongly against that strap, you've got an isometric contraction, not through internal resistance, but external resistance using the strap. So the strap provides external resistance. And if we continue from here and we do some forward flexions, try to keep those knees bent through the whole sequence and keep the pressure out on the strap. So the knees continue to press out against the strap through the whole stroke. And that can be fairly difficult sometimes as you come up, especially when you hit the top end of the lift. So here's external resistance as we flex forward. We turn sideways. As we flex forward, the hamstrings are engaged and they are lengthening, so that is an eccentric contraction. When they start to engage and shorten as we come up, that's a concentric contraction. So here's an eccentric, concentric, eccentric, concentric. Let's do a few more. And release. You can drop that belt. Put that aside. We'll come back to it later. So that's the basics of internal resistance, external resistance, and the three different types of muscle contractions. So what we're going to do next is take a look at a couple different movements that we can use internal resistance or external resistance, or both of them together, to add to the spiciness, the intensity of that particular movement. So let's take a look to start at a really simple movement, and that is just a simple arm lift. So if we were to use internal resistance on the arm lift, what we would do is we would picture the hands moving wide but being resisted with the arm muscles. So the tendency is the arms to go wide as we lift, but keep them in. So you will notice that the arms, as they lift and come down, focus on pressing the hands out, at the same time resisting that outward movement internally. So there's internal resistance using the arms. Many people, me included, find internal resistance using the arms to be a bit more difficult than internal resistance using some of the stronger muscles that you find in the legs. And I don't know if that's simply because the arm muscles are that much weaker, or if I'm just not tuned into them as well. Could be either. So there's internal resistance. The tendency for the arms to go wide, but we're resisting internally. Here's an alternate way using external resistance. I'm going to use a belt. Same basic movement. So I'm going to pull on that belt so the arms are pulling wide, and you will feel some muscle engagement in the back of the shoulders, and you'll probably feel some muscle engagement here also in the pecs. So pull a little wide and then lift and drop. Breath work here. Inhale, lift. Exhale, drop. Inhale, lift. Exhale, drop. Inhale. Exhale. Notice how you feel in the back of the shoulders as you go through this stroke. Notice that, especially in my case, I feel this movement much more. I have much broader muscle engagement using external rotation instead of internal rotation. Let's do one more. And release. One thing we can do here is we can combine external and internal, and we can combine multiple externals. And what we're going to do is combine two movements that we just did. So I've got the strap again up above the knees. I've got the second strap in my hands. I'm going to bend the knees a tiny little bit. I'm going to press out against the white strap, the blue strap here. Inhale, lift. Exhale, come down. Inhale, lift. Exhale, come down. So I want you to notice what you feel when you do the two of these together. And we can modify this somewhat and add a forward flexion. Let me turn sideways so you can see. Knees bent, press out against that knee strap. Arms come up, arms come down, and we do a forward flexion. Arms up, arms down. And release. So there we've combined a couple of external resistances into a more complex movement. And we're going to take a look at a couple other movements here. Oh, yes. There's one more thing I'd like to mention in terms of external resistance, and that is that you can use a partner, someone that can come in and provide some external resistance. In the case that we were just looking at with the forward flexion, we had the belt and we were pressing out against that belt. Another good resistance that really makes this movement powerful is if you had someone that could push against your shins, so push them back so that you were pushing your shins forward like this against them. That leads to some really strong movement. And you'll find that if you've got something like that where you can push the shins forward really strongly, that external resistance really changes the forward flexion into quite a different feel, since the muscles are engaged in different ways. The feeling that you get from doing that movement is quite a bit different than just a standard forward flexion if you're just doing it without any of the internal or external resistances. So let's look at another movement here. What I'd like to look at is table. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a strap for the external resistance, and we're going to go through internal resistance. And in Roger's case, we did a lot of internal resistance. And let's go through them. So from table position, the actions that we did include this: just above the wrist, forward, so towards the top end of your mat. just above the wrist, in towards the other wrist. The elbow presses out. It is resisted by the bicep in. The tricep presses back towards the back of the mat, and the shoulders themselves press wide apart. So let's look at all of those things. Above the wrist, just above the wrist, press forward towards the front of your mat. Just above the wrist, presses in towards the other wrist. The elbows press away from each other. The biceps press towards each other. The triceps press back, in other words, back towards the back of the mat. And the shoulders themselves press wide, press quite wide. So if we do that particular movement, I'm going to switch around to the side. If we do all of those actions, all of those internal resistances, we can then hold those as we do a little more complex movement. So I'm holding or trying to hold all of those different actions while I do a more complex movement with the rest of my body. So that is internal resistance. And what I'd like to look at next is going to be external resistance. How do you do that in a table position? Well, we come back to good old strap. And I may need to adjust this. Yes, I do. We're going to put the strap a little bit below the shoulders so that when we're in a table position, it's still a little too tight. So that we've got the strap to push against. So this is using external resistance, in this case, a strap. So there we go. We've got the strap kind of midway between the elbows and the shoulders. We're going to press out against the strap. And you will notice as you press out, what happens to the muscle engagement in your upper torso and your arms, shoulders. What happens there? Lots of muscles engage as you press out against that strap. You've got a lot of muscle engagement in an isometric form. So we're going to come back to that same movement that we did before. We would press out against the strap. There's our external resistance. We're going to take our right knee straight to the side and then shoot that leg across the body so that the foot ends up way over on the left side of the mat. Keeping both arms straight, both arms engaged, pressing out against that strap. Notice the hip lift. Bring the knee back and down. Left side, left knee up. Shoot that knee and foot across the body so the foot is now way over on the right side. Keep pressing against that strap. The hip lifts way up towards the sky. Bring the knee back and down. Right side. Left side. Let's do one more each side. and release. So there's table with some external resistance. And you will notice how it feels. So that additional engagement, that muscle engagement from having the external resistance really does make a difference in how the movement takes place, what muscles are involved in the movement, or in just being stable. In this case, the front edge, the front of the body is stable. But with a change in the muscle engagement, the feeling of movement changes quite a bit. So we're going to take a look at a warrior position. I know it as front warrior. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at it without any resistance. We're going to then look at internal resistance, and then we're going to look at external resistance. And in this case, we're going to use the blocks for our external resistance. So, front warrior, I believe this is warrior 1, maybe. I can never keep track of them. So, we're going to start like this. I'm going to step back with my right foot. So both feet are facing the front of the mat. Okay? And what we'll do is we'll bring the shin forward so that the shin is vertical, thigh somewhere close to being horizontal, parallel to the floor, pressing up here at the hamstring. Okay? So let's look at the internal resistances, the actions that go on in this pose. The first series is similar to what we did with forward flexion. So just below the ankle bone, presses in together. Just above the ankle, presses out. Knee presses in, upper thigh presses out. So my forward leg under the ankle bone presses in, above the ankle bone presses out towards the backyard there. The knee presses in, the thigh presses out towards the backyard. So with all of those engaged, we come into front warrior. The final one is a lift here in the hamstring so that the hamstring is engaged and lifting up towards the ceiling, kind of at an angle, but hamstring is lifting up towards the ceiling. So there is your internal resistance, and there is an isometric contraction right there. Now, from here, we would normally do something like a front lunge, where we flex forward, come back up. We try to maintain all of those resistances, all of those actions as we continue to do this movement. And come on out. So let's take a look at external resistance doing that same pose. So I'm going to use 2 blocks here. I've got one block vertical. I've got the other block is going to be horizontal. And it is going to go just above my ankle. So hopefully you can see that okay. Both feet facing forward, come into front warrior. Hip is forward. The internal resistance here, the hamstring is engaged again. So we're pressing strongly forward against that block. So the shin is really engaged forward against the block. And then we would do the very same forward flexion, forward flexion, forward flexion. And come on out. So that's one way of doing an external resistance in one of the warrior poses. You could do the same block setup with the blocks against the wall for warrior 1 and 2. Warrior 3, since it is more like this, you can't really do that. If you had a strap that you could strap against the wall, you could do warrior 3 with the strap above the thigh. One thing you could do is use a longer strap. This is a typical yoga strap. I think it's about 8 feet long. And what you can do is you can put the strap around the back foot. Here's my back foot right here. Notice the strap. So the strap is around the arch of the back foot. I'm going to put it just below the knee of the front foot, and I'm going to stretch that out so that the strap is taut, and I'm pressing strongly forward here on the front leg. So from the same position, we can then go in and do our front lunges. Pushing forward strongly against that strap. And release. So that is an alternate way of providing external resistance in the warrior 1 and warrior 2 poses. We're going to look at one more pose, and that is going to be a combination of poses that typically get done all the time, and that would be down dog, plank, and up dog. And what we are going to do is we're going to see if we can do some internal resistance. Checking there we go. Internal resistance as we do these movements. Doing external resistance in such a free-flowing combination as down dog, plank, and up dog is a little bit more difficult. However, if you've got someone that's willing to work with you, you could have them provide resistance. And the key resistance in these three poses is at the hamstrings back. So if we look at a down dog, let me get this out of here. If we look at down dog, the key internal resistance that we want to watch is the hamstrings back. So let's see what that looks like. Start in plank just to get the length correct, and then I'm going to come into down dog, knees bent a little bit, nice long spine, and then push the hamstrings back towards the back of your mat. Hamstrings press back. You're not going to straighten the legs, because typically if you straighten the legs, the back is going to bend. We want to have a really long back that is in something similar to a cow position from cat-cow. We want to have a nice long back with a nice long curve through the entire spine. So typically that means keeping the knees bent a little bit. Now, some of you may be flexible enough to do that with straight legs, but it's probably better to keep a little bit of bend in the knee so that the internal resistance, the internal action of pressing the thigh towards the back does not lock the leg back. So again, we'll start in plank. We'll come into down dog, press the hamstring back. So the hamstrings are going to press really strongly back towards the back of the mat. If you had someone there
to provide some external resistance. They could push on your hamstrings, put a block across them, or just push with their hands. And then we're going to keep that upward action, that backward action of the hamstrings as we come into plank, so that hamstrings are lifting up towards the ceiling right now. And then as we continue, we're going to drop the hips even further. Keep that lift in the hamstrings up as we come down into up dog. The shoulders are going to be wide. Think wide on the shoulders, just above the wrists. Come in, elbows out, shoulders out. The triceps push back, similar to what we were doing in table. We move back to plank, keep the hamstrings lifted. We bend the knees, come back to down dog. Keep the hamstrings pushing back. Keep those hamstrings pressing up as we transition to plank. Into up dog, shoulders broad, wrists just above the wrists together, elbows out, shoulders out, triceps back. Back to plank, hamstrings. Push back. Keep that lift in the hamstrings. To plank. Keep that lift one more time as we move into up dog. Plank. Down dog. And then slowly drop the knees down. Keep the butt back. Keep the knees floating a little bit. Bring the knees all the way down and release. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Hopefully you've learned a little something about internal and external resistance and how you can use that to change the dynamics of the yoga poses that you do and change the way that they feel. Hopefully gain a little more strength, a little more range of motion, and add a little more spice to your yoga practice. So thanks for joining me today. Namaste.